Cool. Wait for the creepy voice to end. So welcome everybody to another Earlywork event. It's awesome to have all of you here. Yes, Mel, this will be shared in the community afterwards, so you can rewatch it as after this. So welcome to Building Brands That Challenge the Norm with the one and only Lucy Wark from Normal. She's done an amazing job at building, challenging like the norms around like sexual wellness through the brand. So it's really exciting to have her here to chat through how she's actually done that. So without further ado, I might get Lucy, if you want to share your screen and get all that set up.
Yeah.
And at the end, we will be taking audience questions. So feel free to drop your questions in the Slido, which I'm gonna share in the chat now. So open that up. You can upvote questions as well. So if someone's asked a really good question that you want to hear, just hit the thumbs up. And at the end, we'll just call people up or just go like from top to bottom for the questions. So yeah, over to you, Lucy. Take it away.
Okay. Thanks everyone for joining. I'm Lucy. I'm the founder of Normal. If you don't know us, we're an Australian sexual wellness brand. Our mission is sort of create the first generation to explore sex and relationships without shame or stress. And I'll take you through a little bit of what we've done and then jump into some stuff that's specifically about brand building and thinking about how you create brands that enable people to participate in behaviours that might have been taboo, or to sort of challenge a stigma or open up a space in a new way, which is obviously really essential to what we do at Normal. And then obviously love to do a bunch of questions. So feel free to throw all those at me. And yeah, if there's something that like you are really curious about midway through the presentation, feel free to kind of like either put something in the chat or just unmute yourself. I'm happy for this to be like a little bit less of a lecture. And also, if any of you do want to put your videos on, that's also really nice as well. It's lovely to have like faces reacting as well as the, you know, blank screen of death. Beautiful. Okay, so just a quick bit of like info about, you know, what's the context in this space. Basically, like the way that we look at the world at Normal is like technology is making it possible for us to have effectively like a second sexual revolution. Like where the first one that we all heard about in like the 60s and 70s was this reaction against tradition and reaction against censorship and reaction against sort of norms that said like we can't talk about sex, no one should be having sex before marriage, no one should be using birth control, all those types of things, was an incredibly powerful step. What the hard thing that has sort of come about like over the last few decades is that that revolution has probably sort of helped some people more than others. And so like the feminist critique is often like that it, a lot of the kind of gains in sexual freedom were like by men at the expense of women and LGBTQ people. I think there's a more nuanced story there that's essentially like the way that the, you know, the way that we learn sex still hasn't caught up to the science of sex, and it still hasn't caught up to sort of incorporate the experiences and sort of pleasure of all people in our society. So if you know, use the kind of freely available digital resources to think about sex in our society, like you end up with like Google, Pornhub, Reddit, and those spaces tend to be like pretty unwelcoming, often sort of have issues around consent, safe sex, diversity, and a whole bunch of other stuff. But the interesting thing is as well that like those same technologies which have in some ways created those spaces have also enabled us to see and hear new perspectives, and particularly sort of enabled over the last like 5 years a set of really distinct and important changes that have created like a tipping point moment. So we're starting to hear a lot more perspectives about sort of the science of sex, about queer sexuality, about things like sexual assault and consent. Apologies, I should have given a trigger warning at the beginning of this, but I'm giving it now. The thing that we're trying to do at Normal is essentially say, like, what does the end state of this look like? And let's design for that world. Like what would, if we had a blank slate that we could design from, what would like the best version of how we all explore sex and relationships look like, and sort of capitalizing on these trends and the news stories that we're starting to hear, and building that sort of the momentum behind that movement. So what we do at Normal is we started off in our sort of MVP over the last year, we've launched like an e-commerce store, which is doing sort of a new take on things like sex toys and essentials. We do a lot of education through our TikTok, Instagram, and our sort of online like sex ed library. So there's like a large kind of collection of articles about, you know, most of the common questions people have around sex, sexual health and pleasure. And we also have a deeper video masterclass as well. And then like, here are some stats on what we've done, but essentially like we've reached a lot of people, we have a lot of customers, and we've launched this big product. Today I'm talking about like, how do you build a successful brand in a space that feels like a taboo for a lot of people? First up, I'll touch on what actually is a brand. Here I owe a lot to the amazing head of design at Eucalyptus, or head of brand at Eucalyptus, Liv King, because this is a framework of hers. I'll interpret it for normal, but I just want to like give her credit. Then I'll talk through like how do you actually leverage social science, and there is a lot of social science and social psychology behind how you create behavior change. So how do we do that at Normal? How can you think about it in other brands that you're working on? Pitfalls to watch out for, so things that brands get wrong when they're trying to do big kind of stigma breaking or norm challenging work. And then like, I think thinking as well, you know, a lot of people tend to approach brand as something that like sits at the top of the funnel, is often super expensive. Brand marketing feels not very relevant for startups. We should all be growth hackers. Like performance marketing or like sort of like, you know, organic growth loops are the only things that are worth learning about. And I think you should have a lot of skepticism about like big Super Bowl ads for sure, but it can be worth thinking about like what are the use cases for a sort of like larger pieces of big brand exciting stuff, and how can you make those part of a sort of winning formula for growing a startup as well. And I see a couple of comments. Oh, yep, cool. Those are just like Marina. Awesome. All right, so what makes a brand? And I think, you know, a lot of people in startups think branding is like logo, colors, and like a couple of like stock photos, and you're like, yeah, and we're off to the races. Like that is not the type of brand that we are talking about today. What I'm talking about is like meaningful, memorable, and authentic brands. And the differentiator would be like, this is the type of brand that can motivate distinctly new types of consumer behavior, or even sort of motivate a consumer to invest much more than they would otherwise in something because they want to be associated with that brand. So it has to mean a lot to them, and it has to be able to motivate change. Basically, a brand actually breaks out into three things. Visual identity is generally what people think of when they think of brand. So it's like, what does this brand look like to me? It's actually worth thinking much more clearly about things like strategic identity as well. So how does this brand behave? What does it do in the world? And then how does this brand talk? What's its voice like? So to sort of run through a little bit more detail on that, like in strategic identity, you have everything in the kind of realm of values, mission, principles, and positioning. In verbal identity, you have narrative, tone of voice, personality, and messaging. And in a visual identity, you have all the things you expect. And so when you're thinking about building a brand, definitely make sure that you're not just doing the visual identity. Like think of a visual identity as like a nice wrapping on a present, but if it is unclear like what the brand is trying to say and where it stands in the world and what it stands for, then you'll struggle to have that mean very much to people for very long. A really lovely example of this is a brand like Patagonia. So they have managed to build this incredibly strong, loyal kind of customer base around their message of sort of environmentalism, sustainability, and like genuinely encouraging people to enjoy the outdoors. And so with a brand like that, yes, they have this kind of distinctive visual identity that people recognize, but they also have very clear campaigns that have distinct perspectives that sort of say like, actually, like we're against fast fashion, we're against like Black Friday sales, we are for these types of environmental causes, and then they back it up and actually do things about it. So they're a very consistent and well-built brand, and that's part of why they have so much resonance for their user base. When we started Normal, we began with like an MVP. So you might think MVP, usually in startups, this is a minimum viable brand. There's some good thinking out there on this. You can sort of Google it. But a couple of the first things that you should be able to kind of tell yourself before you actually think like, what's our strategic identity? What's our verbal identity? What's our visual identity? Is like, who is this brand? Can you summarize it as a persona? Can you give us a few kind of clear statements about what it means to people? And so with Normal, we said actually like the most important thing that we want people to take away from this is like, it's like a cool older sibling with a sexology degree. Like it is approachable, it feels warm, it feels educated, it feels informative. It feels like all of those things. Here is like the very first version of that I wrote out. So I screenshotted that from a Notion earlier today. But that was kind of like where we started when we were thinking about like, who is this and like, who do we want it to be to people? I think it's very easy, like For example, in this space, you know, if you think about, okay, we all have seen like the sex shops on King's, you know, like in King's Cross, we've all seen like underwear ads before. We've all seen the kind of like vice aesthetic that exists in the world of sex and relationships that's about using kind of titillation, and often like kind of porny and corny titillation to sort of attract people into the space. Actually, like, you know, thinking about where do you want to stand in relation to that set of influences. And then sort of on the other side of that is probably the like highly feminized, like very cutesy, like sets of kind of sex toy brands, where it's just like, just make it pink and like write empowerment on the website. And we wanted to be very clear that we were like not necessarily either of those things, and we want to be more substantial than that as well. For normal, you know, in terms of how do we carry through like cool older sibling sexology degree, like in terms of how we behave, we wanted to say like, this is a brand that represents like what the future of this space should look like. We want to make a set of really clear commitments around things like LGBTQ plus support. So we donate like a percentage of our sales to -18. All of our toys have names that are kind of deliberately gender neutral. All of our education is deliberately gender neutral. We've invested heavily in kind of creating products that are around that. We're big on sort of sustainability and recycling as well. So we have a sex toy buyback program. We're very big on normalizing conversations about sex in the public sphere and making it okay to talk about this. And we're also big on providing the research agenda that's been missing and the facts that have been missing from public debates, which has motivated a lot of our research work that we then turn into big brand campaigns as well. So that's like how we behave as a brand. Then it's like, how do we talk? And I think in this space, we've had a lot of really interesting like trade-offs. You know, how do you think about like, what is the right tone when it comes to talking about sex when you want to normalize conversations? You don't want to seem, I think, like a damper on those conversations, but there are very serious conversations happening around issues like consent, safe sex, diversity and discrimination. There are also very funny things about sex and very like lighthearted things that we all like to laugh about. And so figuring out where the line is and figuring out like what our voice looks like in relation to that is a really important part of it. So we sort of have had like, you know, distinct moments where as a brand, we've stepped back from a campaign. We even like pulled a truck before it went out because we actually thought like, actually this tone is not us and we're not going to be proud of it in 6 months or 12 months if we did it. And so we've sort of deliberately kind of like stepped back from certain things. We've also created things where you can kind of, I'm not an avatar. This is me and our sex coach on our podcast. Like, I'm not actually an avatar, but we do kind of in some ways create avatars of the brand or representatives of the brand who can speak for it in a really real way. And that's like one of the things that we do in order to humanize something that can, and humanize a space and a new way of talking that for a lot of people can be very unintuitive. And then we run ads where grandmas hold up sex toys. And this is an ad of ours that got like, so I think this is part of the teaser for this event. Marina, your promo reminded me that I should talk about it. But yeah, basically like we, in thinking about the type of ads that we have run, we wanted to normalize the conversation to like, we're very comfortable with challenging people when we believe in it and when we stand behind it. And that's kind of what this ad was about. So it essentially, I wonder if I can get this to.
Normal makes sex
Can everyone hear
so
that?
easy that Nana Geraldine, who spells sex instead of saying sex, can talk about it.
Quinn uses pulses of air pressure to stimulate the clitoris. Yes, I said the C word. With a sensation that feels like the best oral sex I've had since the fall of the Berlin Wall. Get sex toys from this century at itsnormal.com.
So anyway, that ad is one that we actually have used running on like sort of Channel 9 and Channel 10's like digital on demand players. And that was where we got about 69 complaints to, which was like number 5 brand in Australia last year. So we got 69 complaints to the Consumer Ad Commission, all of which were rejected. And we sort of, again, it's like, I think that principle of being like, as a brand, you know, we are trying to prompt a social change. We are trying to prompt a different social conversation. We believe that like, you know, respectful, informed, like humorous conversations of sex belong in the public sphere. And like in kind of how we defended that against those 69 complaints, we sort of talked repeatedly about like the failings of the sex education system, the ways in which, you know, this is about using an anatomical term. Like people were very upset that a grandma said the word clitoris, but actually sort of saying like, look, this is an anatomical term. She's not saying anything, like she is not using titillation. We are not using like scare tactics. We're not using anything inappropriate for the age, like demographic of the set of people who are seeing this. Like, this is actually like truly an ad that we stand behind. And I think partly because of that, we've been able to push boundaries further than other brands who are clearly kind of using like shock value or extremism and sort of almost under the guise of like empowerment, like to push their agendas. So sort of, I think being consistent and having like a clear set of standards so that when you do make strong statements, you're very comfortable defending them. And also knowing when you're not going to say something or what you're not going to do is an important part of like, how do you get a brand to talk well in this type of space? Conscious of time, so I'm going to try and speed it up. Yeah, visual identity is probably the one that you'd all know the most. I think probably just like the important things to call out here is like, you know, this is everything from fonts and logos through to like, do you have assets you can use in performance marketing? Do you have assets that tell your story well, as opposed to just sort of having to tell your story through like text and stuff like that as well. Yeah, in terms of like the test I use is like, have you created a meaningful, memorable and authentic brand? Is like, if it's very clear that like if your team and your users can say that feels right and that feels wrong when they see a statement or they see an ad and they're like, that feels like normal, that doesn't feel like normal, that's usually a good start. So if it's like, if it is a strong enough perspective that they know it when they see it, like even if you took the brand's name off, that they know it when they see it, and if they can sort of complain when there's something feels wrong, that'll generally be like a really good test of like, have you managed to create a brand that feels quite strong? I think the other just note that I'd make there is like, I think a lot of brands, particularly in this kind of the space of like, how do we change norms? How do things alter? How does social change happen? Like you, trying to find the right words for this. Okay, I'll come back to it. Never mind. How do you use social science to create behavior change? This is just one side, don't worry. But essentially like with normal, like when it comes to sex and relationships, the biggest thing that came out of our early user interviews was that actually most people's biggest question is like, am I normal and am I doing it right? And that's everything from like, am I masturbating right? Am I having sex right? Am I bad at sex? Am I good at sex? Is it normal to desire this? Is it normal to desire this thing? How should I be like dating? I have no fucking idea how to flirt with people on the internet. Like what's the right thing to do in relationships? Like we are constantly socially oriented around this behavior. And I think that's true around a lot of taboo behaviors that we are, you know, in spaces where we can't talk to other people or we only talk to a very small circle of people, we're actually constantly looking for social calibration about what is like the right way to be doing things. And in spaces where there have been taboos, we're looking for social calibration. So with normal, like we sort of thought like, what are all of the kind of parts of social science and social psychology that you can use to your advantage to create space and comfort for people to engage in a new behavior for them, which in this case is, you know, buying sex toys and then investing in sex education. So we think about that as like, how do you use like things like parasocial relationships? So an influencer relationship or a celebrity relationship can be really powerful because we feel like we know those people. And so we associate that as sort of, if it's okay for them, it's okay for me. In-group effects, similarly, like people who we identify with. So Georgia, our sex coach, is like incredibly like approachable, lovely, and like the opposite of what people think of when they think of like a sex shop. And so she has been sort of a really powerful like advocate for our brand and someone who makes people feel very comfortable, makes them feel like people like me use this. Social proof is disproportionately important when you're trying to change behavior around this as well. So sort of hearing, even if it's anonymous reviews from other people where they sort of talk about like their needs, their behavior, and where they say things that you empathize with becomes really powerful. Reframing linguistics, like you will notice that every brand in this space says sexual wellness. They do not say sex toys, vice, or anything else. It's in one way a little bit sad because I think at some point we'll probably hit a point where we are actually just owning that this is a space that can be about like education and pleasure and those things being great in and of themselves. But if you need to call it wellness in the short term, then like fine. Aesthetic signaling. So thinking about like, if you're trying to do a brand that is changing people's attitudes or behavior, use every piece of your brand. Don't just use the words you write. Make sure that, you know, like with this, like the way that we designed our toys, we deliberately made them non-anatomical. So like most people think of like a giant pink, like wobbling fleshy dildo when they think of sex toys. So being like, how do we move as far away as possible from that to make it look like a lifestyle object that fits in with the rest of your life? Then things like mimetic modeling. So essentially, like if you've never heard of mimesis, read the book Wanting. Mimesis is the reason Peter Thiel invested in Facebook. It's essentially like human beings are incredibly influenced by the desires of others, and they shape our desires and they shape our behavior. So for us, we sort of said, like, how can we create avatars in this case, which is like me and Georgia and other people who sort of speak for the brand, who can tell, give people that kind of next level up from, hey, I'm feeling more comfortable and people like me do this, to hey, I've watched people talk about this in a different way, and now I have the language and the tone and the set of phrasings that I can use to sort of engage in this space in a new way and take back into my relationships and my friendships and everything like that. And then of course, humor. Humor is incredibly powerful when used well to break taboos, and incredibly dangerous if you don't use it well. So just make sure that you're using good judgment if you do use humor. All right, pitfalls, getting there. Basically, like, we've all heard of greenwashing. We've probably heard of pinkwashing, which is being like, you know, wrapping a kind of like light empowerment bow around a company like International Women's Day every year, or like Pride Month every year, when, you know, suddenly companies like logos go rainbow, but they don't do anything about it the rest of the year. I think, like, I would always emphasize, like, if your brand is making commitments to something, by all means talk about them openly and publicly and use them as selling points, but make sure that you are not just like doing the light touch version of those things, because I think we live increasingly in a social media environment where you will be called out for it. Failing to consult stakeholders in the space is actually a really big one. So I, like, for example, absolutely love Overa and the work that they've done, but they had like a really unfortunate case study of failing to do this well with one of their campaigns earlier this year. So it was about a sort of like used a truck, put it in front of, I think, a Sydney boys' school after a kind of repeating the words of a judge who had sort of essentially concluded that a woman was like asking for it in some form of like sexual assault or assault. Anyway, there was a kind of court case about that. The unfortunate thing was, like, they hadn't in that case spoken to the people who were affected by that crime, and they hadn't spoken to the people who were sort of at the center of it, and then had also unfortunately like failed to speak to a number of activists who they'd asked to promote, like, or failed to kind of close the loop with a number of activists who they'd asked to promote the campaign when it came out. So it sort of backfired and became something that was much more about them sort of attaching themselves to the space without doing the work, and in fact sort of silencing survivors for a second time, or sort of like subverting the wishes of survivors for a second time. Like, this is especially true in any space where you're dealing with like really kind of important and like large social harms, like things like domestic violence, things like sexual assault, but it's an important lesson to learn. And I know that that's a thing that brand will have learned from as well. So I think it's always really important to think about, like, if you're trying to do something that is like a big statement, make sure to think about, you know, speaking to people who are affected, speaking to people who are stakeholders, speaking to people who are advocates, to think about, are you doing it in the right way? The other kind of maybe at the other end of the spectrum is just going too broad and bland. Like, if people can't tell what you're against or can't tell what you are for, you probably don't have like a particularly meaningful brand. Then it's like, if you're trying to do big brand stuff, unclear commercial objectives and unclear theory of impact is a bit of an issue. So like, if you're just doing this to like make a splash, but you can't connect it back to any kind of metric, or in either like a medium or a long-term way, then you probably shouldn't be doing it. And finally, like a pitfall that a lot of brands fall into is if you spend too much time in your own space or in your own business, you tend to think that the things that you find interesting or important are interesting or important to the public as a whole. So there are like so many journalists I know who get these press releases from brands that are like, we're doing a stunt, it's going to be great. And they never cover it because they're like, this is boring. Like, it's like inside baseball for you. And we had a problem like on Normal with this recently, where we were trying to come up with an April Fool's Day stunt. And it took us like a couple of iterations because we kept coming up with stuff that was funny and interesting to us and no one else cared. So you really have to like push yourself to be like, from a consumer point of view, if you want to do something that is like viral or big, or amplifiable, you really need to think about like, what do people outside of our space or outside of our audience find interesting or funny, and then think from their viewpoint rather than think from your own viewpoint forwards. Okay, I'm so sorry about the length of time, but we're nearly done. So final thing is like, The nice thing about working on spaces where you're trying to promote social change is you can get like, you know, these are issues where there's a lot of heat and light, and you actually can get a lot of coverage and a lot of attention and engagement if you do things well. I think the kind of thing that most people in startups have a kind of justified skepticism about is like, oh, can I, like, if I do a big splashy brand thing, does that just have a one-off impact and it's not scalable and I can't turn it into something that like consistently feeds growth in my company? And I would say you have to be like absolutely very careful that you don't do that, but there are ways to amplify well, and it's worth thinking about whether you might be able to access those two. So for us, like we did this big campaign late last year during the lockdowns. It was Come On Bondi campaign. We drove a truck that said this all around Bondi. It was very fun. You know, there was like lots of like sort of organic social sharing. And if all we had done was just like, oh, we've just driven this truck around and there's organic social sharing, and maybe we send an email to our user base, I'd be like, this is probably not worth doing. Like very fun, but not worth doing. So what do you do with it? Firstly, it's like you actually kind of have a concerted like strategy for reaching media outlets that are relevant to your audiences, whether that's like sort of briefing them directly or even using like paid media. Secondly, influencers. So we actually had like a bunch of influencers contact us and ask for discount codes that they could offer to their audiences based on loving the stunt, because they were like, oh, cool, this is really fun. But you can actually also like work deliberately with influencers to amplify the things that you are doing. And finally, like for us particularly, we took all of the coverage that we got of this stunt and we turned it into Facebook ads. And that was like the most important amplifier, because it was something that we could push money into again and again in order to get value from that sort of highly engaging, like high reaction type of stunt. So if you're going to do it, make sure you have a really clear strategy to amplify it, and then it turns into a useful growth lever. And that is my rant about brand. So what do people want to know?
Wow. I'm seeing a lot of like claps. Yeah, that was amazing. Actually, Dan, Jono, and I were in our internal Earlywork chat being like, holy shit, there's some really good content in here. And I'm sure a lot of people feel the same. And you see, if you want to like stop sharing your screen, and then we can like see everyone's faces. If we need to bring up the slides again, we can do that. The first question comes from Max Hogue. Do you want to unmute yourself, ask a question?
More than happy to. Hey, Lucy, long-time fan, first-time caller. I'm in the brand space, and I really loved your approach to strategic identity, but I just wanted to get some clarification. How do your principles differ from the mission? And if you're comfortable, would you mind sharing your principles?
Yeah,
really curious.
That's a really good question. I think like a mission should basically be like the thing that you walk into your office and put on the wall. So it's like, it says something about like the world you envision and the change that you want to create to get from present day world to future world. And for us, it's like we believe in a world where you can explore sex and relationships without shame or stress. And the way we want to do that is we know our audience is like Gen Z and millennials, and we want to create the first generation who's able to do that like that. And that's like in a sentence, like if I had a wall, I'd put it on there. But like, I think principles are actually much more about like, how do you make decisions and trade-offs? Like, what do you stand for? What do you not? So for example, like, and I think I can share that deck. There's probably a bunch of them in that sort of almost minimum viable brand thing that I'd interpret as principles. So being like, we use humor in a way that is inclusive and taps into moments that we all know privately but don't say out loud. We don't use humor in a snarky way to hurt people. So being like, what do we stand for and what do we stand against? Or being like, we want to create a space that particularly feels like comfortable and appealing for female identifying and LGBTQ people, but we are not here to sort of demonize male identifying people or exclude them, because they're actually a really important part of this story as well. But sort of so being like, I think clear on who do we stand for, who do we stand against, and how do we make decisions can be a really nice way to do it as well. Yeah.
Amazing. Just quick follow up. So they're just so I understand, they're more principles for how the brand behaves versus principles for how the people at Normal behave to deliver the brand.
Yes.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
It's not a science. I would definitely say it's not a science.
Totally agree.
Great question. There are a lot of anonymous questions in here, but I think it'd be really cool if you want to like pipe up and ask them. So if you put something in the anonymous questions but want to ask it, like DM me and I'll like call you up. But next question, top rated question actually is from Anonymous. So given social media terms and conditions, how has this affected or changed your marketing strategy? And which alternative channels have you found useful?
Yeah, great question. And I think so for anyone who doesn't know, platforms like Facebook and Instagram and TikTok have terms and conditions about what you can say in paid, and have terms and conditions about what you can say in organic or sort of owned channels. Generally, the working rule is you can't show a sex toy in an ad, you can't say sex toy in an ad, you can't link to a landing page that shows a sex toy or says sex toy. It basically means that we have to be more careful and strategic in what we do in paid on those types of channels. So it'll be if we do show a sex toy, it's something that's actually deliberately, it doesn't look like a penis, it looks like a household object. And I think as well, and we've sort of been able to kind of successfully get away with that for a while. But at some point that may well get banned. I think something else that's really helpful there is thinking about how, when you're thinking about text and photo, or text and sort of visual asset, giving people the chance to contextually connect the dots in a way that doesn't break the terms and conditions of the platform. So if you sort of show a hand clutching a bed sheet, and then you show text that's what's your erotic IQ or something, people know what you're talking about, but you haven't actually broken any rules. So I think it does require you to kind of have a set of principles for thinking about how do you create sort of paid stuff that works. It also means that you can use things for example, that kind of amplifying press coverage, because it's coming from an outlet rather than coming from your branded account. You can generally put money behind that type of article pretty easily, or sharing that type of article pretty easily. So there's a bunch of hacky tactics that you can use around that. I think it's interesting in this space. I think you hear a lot of entrepreneurs complain about the inability to access these platforms at all. I think that's certainly true if you're, for example, a sex worker, or if you're doing anything where you're sort of selling sex is inherently your business. But actually, I think to a degree, those types of constraints can become moats if you're better at getting around them than anyone else. And then the other types of channels, this is going to be particularly true if the issue or area that you're working on is something that does generate a fair bit of heat and light and engagement. But I think it actually brings a lot of what you'd probably consider to be upper funnel channels into play and into a level of efficiency, just because it can be so newsworthy, or it can be so interesting that people will kind of click through. One of the things that, so for example, the fact that we've been able to use video on demand at a level of efficiency at the stage that we're at as a startup is kind of insane. Or, even using things like traditional print, broadcast, podcast, all that type of media. I think also things like influencers become really helpful. So influencer and affiliate marketing are great channels. Then thinking about what's in their long term, what's the role of how can you turn organic into a source of decisive sort of CAC advantage that stays sustainable as you get margin compression and copycats into the space. And that is I think where the most exciting stuff is going to happen. Looks like Max has raised a hand.
Hi, yeah, fire away. Hey, Lucy. That was awesome. I really like that. I really like the points around verbal identity, because if I think about brands I love, so many of them have that distinct verbal identity, which creates emotion around the brand. My question is, how did you think about your target customer? And then as a secondary question to that, how did that inform your brand identity?
Ooh, yeah, good question. So I think you use all of the regular tools, which is okay, get as much high quality macro data as you can about, what are the dividing lines in terms of gender, sexuality, generation, income, cultural background, all the different pieces that make up people's opinions and their behaviors. Then sort of match that up with that much deeper level of qualitative, long answer surveys, sort of deeper user interviews to get a sense of personas. So that's a kind of classic, how do you identify that worldview? And then there is a little bit of art to it as well. I think all of that science could definitely tell you some things, and it pointed us in the right direction. But also there was, I think, a point where we were our strong belief about this space is it divides into three main groups. You have sort of people who are cultural conservatives, either for religious or just like secular cultural reasons, for whom like this is going to be a very, very hard lift to get someone to engage with things like buying sex toys, to get someone to engage with things like pleasure as a conversation. Then you have at the other end of the spectrum what we might call sex nerds. So those people are likely to become your sort of earliest advocates and are most comfortable publicly talking about things like sex and relationships and pleasure. But and in some ways, like they are used to kind of transacting in the old version of like how you solve problems in this space, which is like going to something like a Love Honey or going into like a shop in King's Cross. And they have sort of built like the skills, tendencies and behaviors to do that well enough already. But they're still like, and so I think, you know, like our customer is like neither of those people. Our customer is like the median person who has basically like a set of curiosities and desires. So I would love to explore X, Y, or Z. I have this fantasy about X, Y, or Z. I would really like to be able to like do X, Y, or Z. Like, but also has a set of like internalized stigmas, has a set of anxieties, probably comes with a fairly large amount of baggage to this space as well. And so like, how do we talk to that person? And like, what is going to be like the correct voice for that person is like the kind of thing that shaped that. Like, it's like a cool older sibling with a sexology degree. Like they are approachable, they're educational, it's evidence-based, but it's not like a school lesson. It is still like a kind of fun and engaging conversation, and they know when to crack jokes. Like, and yeah, so that's kind of like how we thought about it, is like that there is broadly like the trend in this space is going to be from like sex nerds being the main people who engage with it to like the majority of the population engaging with it, and how do we build for that trend? Yeah.
Cool. Thanks, Lucy.
No worries.
Awesome. Amira, you had a great question about like the education side of things.
Yes. Hi, Lucy. Amazing talk. Really loved that. I was just wondering if you thought about like partnerships with schools, creating like content specifically for schools. I don't know about you guys, but we did not have this kind of education when I went to school, and it would have been super useful. And yeah, I just wanted to know if you thought about that.
Yeah, the answer is definitely. I was also went to a very similar school. Like we basically got the condom on the banana. And then like our PE teacher felt very awkward and explained that hymens break when you're horse riding, and that was about it. So super useful. Yeah, like my view of the way that this space evolves is like that, you know, with normal, like our very first opportunity is in B2C, but our second opportunity is basically in educational institutions and families as sort of users of like high quality, like evidence-based, modular, engaging education for the next generation. So things that kind of, particularly for a generation of digital natives who are going to be learning about all of this online, like I think create, and like in a world where teachers are usually like, whether at university or at school, are not well equipped to deliver this type of content. Like it really is actually quite specialist content. Yeah, so I think like it's definitely a huge part of it. Like we've sort of worked with about 10 Australian unis already in delivering that type of kind of sessions on and programs on campus. So that's something we want to scale up to about 100 over the next year. Yeah, so sort of Australia and overseas. But yeah, I'd say it's like, it's a thing where I think with partnerships like that, and this is probably like the transferable insight maybe on the kind of how do you build brands in these types of spaces, is like that I think if you're working on any kind of big social issue, like you need to think about like, how do we earn the right to speak? How do we earn legitimacy in this space? And so for Normal, I think one of the reasons why we've always had those kind of like relatively clear principles about like, here are jokes we will and won't make, and here is how we like talk in the world, is because we have a view to that kind of longer horizon too, which is that we want to be able to kind of be the translating layer between sort of a set of like administrators and parents who have a duty of care or a sense of concern for a younger generation, and like sort of a younger generation who are looking for engaging and high quality sex positive sources on this, and being able to kind of play that role well. And so in terms of how we think about like, how do we build legitimacy to do that, it's about firstly, like having a kind of research agenda that we're constantly publishing on that is treated as legitimate by like high quality press sources. It's like working with a lot of universities and getting really strong student feedback from them. It's all the things that kind of give you the right to be the representative of young people and be the translator in the space. And I think that's always a good way to think about it. Like, it's very easy to say we're going to do X, Y, or Z. It's much harder to actually build trust and credibility to do it.
Great question. I've got a hand up. Do you want to unmute and ask a question?
Yeah, sorry, my name's Matt, but I'm just using my friend's laptop because mine died. Thanks for the presentation, Lucy. It was really great. So quick question. I was having a browse on the normal website and came across you guys selling cock rings. And correct me if I'm wrong, that's a male sex toy.
Yeah.
So my question is, so normal sells predominantly more female sex toys. Is there plans for normal in the future to maybe expand to the male sex toy space, or just keep within the female space?
Yeah, so we, like, the answer is like, fuck yes, we want to do the toys for people with penises space. Like, and there's a bunch of reasons why. Firstly, like, it's actually already a really large market, but it hasn't seen the kind of disruption that you've seen for the kind of like female and LGBTQ like community. So there are a lot more brands targeting that sort of group of users than there are targeting kind of, you know, whether it's like young heterosexual, young queer men, like people with penises in general. Like the conversation for that group of people is probably 10 to 15 years behind. Like, you know, lots of young women will talk to me and be like, yeah, I talk to my friends all the time about sex toys, masturbation, generally like the ways in which sort of young men or people with penises are like invited into those conversations is like, it's humorous banter, but you'd never seriously talk about it. And like, if you do kind of talk about sex or masturbation, you're like, the way that you experience pleasure is generally seen as like simple and like slightly laughable. And I think we're often kind of, we set our expectations very low because as a person with a penis, like our culture is set up the way that we have sex to make it easier for you to have an orgasm. And it is probably like physically a bit easier to have an orgasm, which means that we don't interrogate like, would you like to have different types? Would you like to experience more? Would you like to have the ability to have multiple orgasms? Would you like to be a different type of partner? Like, we don't ask those types of questions very much. And I think, yeah, there's just like an absolutely enormous space there. So we've done a big internal research project about, you know, what are all of the kind of behaviors, values, attitudes that people in the kind of younger, like male and people with penises demographic bring to the topic of sex toys. There's a whole bunch of really interesting findings that are shaping like a new range that we're releasing, which will be paired with a bunch of educational content as well, to sort of help reshape that. And I think it's one of those ones where if you just like throw a physical product at the market, you are not going to have much impact. Like, I think like, yes, you can sort of bring the same like change in design and branding, and that will go some of the way. But I think really digging into like, what are the reservations and stereotypes that people bring to this space, and how do you use that kind of same set of social science levers that I was talking about earlier to disrupt them deliberately and help reshape those behaviors. That's what will be really powerful on this one. So I'm really excited to get into that space. Yeah, and actually also fun fact, Australia's most Googled sex toy is a toy for people with penises. So 25,000 people search for the fleshlight every month. And it's a terribly marketed and terribly made product. And it's just like ridiculous. Yeah, so anyway, you should do that business.
Thanks, Lucy.
Cool. Ani, do you want to unmute and ask the question?
Hey, Ani.
Hey, Lucy. Right, slightly different one. How do you balance performance marketing and brand building for like long-term growth? And what about like other channels generally? Because like obviously D2C, like you know, social media is the way to go, but like with the challenges that you find with like the limitations, like surely building an amazing email list and like really like spending a lot on content there, or even like partnering with like influencers and like getting them interested, because I'm sure there's a lot of like sex positive influencers out there. Like, what's your kind of take on?
Like, how do you think about all of those elements, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question. Yeah,
I mean, I think there's like, you know, there can definitely be that like false dichotomy of like brand building is big and expensive, and performance marketing is scalable and inexpensive, and we should all be doing performance marketing. I would say like that you should look for the exceptions to that rule. Like it is, I think, generally true. Like there was a world where like startups did genuinely used to buy like huge Super Bowl ads and it was a terrible idea, or like buy big billboards and it was a terrible idea. So I think being smart about like where do the exceptions lie, because there are probably underpriced assets, and particularly if you can get your content and creative right, then you can actually take advantage of those, and then you like amplify what you've done really well. I think also like if you're thinking about investments in brand, at least having a view when you make those investments of like, what is the payoff timeline? How will we know that these are working? Like, is it, for example, measuring like branded search so that you can see like how much people are coming organically because of it? Like, you know, there's a bunch of ways to measure that, but I think thinking like we expect this to produce like 20% uplift in our performance marketing efforts over this time. And we will know it by X, like at least having those kind of like clear metrics in your head so it doesn't become a kind of unaccountable bucket of spend that you push money into. I think the other thing is also like where performance marketing has more predictable outcomes, like the really exciting sweet spots in brand tend to be asymmetric upside. So like it costs about $2,000 to rent a truck for the day in Sydney. And the upside that we saw on that investment was in the like realm of like 100x or whatever, like within a couple of days. So like there are actually like, if you can find those types of brand experiments, like brand doesn't have to be expensive either. So I think, yeah, that's the kind of brand performance marketing, you know, dichotomy. I think then if you're talking about like email lists, social engagement, which might be veering more into like, how do you think about lifecycle marketing and organic, which can be like, you know, these are all like slightly fuzzy distinctions, but like it's kind of the like, you know, you can define these channels and areas in different ways. I do think on those, like, again, it's probably like having a very clear sense of like, what does this thing translate into for us? And therefore like, how does investment work in it? So like with email marketing, you're like, if we can keep our email marketing list at like 80 or 90% like responsive and non-suppressed, what does that do to our ability to drive revenue at like a 3, 6, 9 and 12 month revenue like mark or whatever the thing is? So actually just like being really clear about like what is the thing that you want out of that can generally help you figure out how much to trade off, you know, time, energy and money in those things. Yeah.
And how do you think about like LTV expansion in that case? Because with like normal, you know, if you're selling physical products, like obviously you can sell them other ones.
Yeah.
Like, is it that education play? Is it the let's help you have better sex play? Like, how do you think about it?
Yeah. So I this is one of those things where I'm like, I don't know if I can talk about this publicly yet. Sorry, I might take a pass on that one. But the TLDR would be like, expect exciting announcements in a couple of months.
Ani asking the hard-hitting questions.
Yeah. I think like your instinct is generally right, which is like, hey, if you're in a physical product business, particularly one where it's like people tend to buy like say one a year, which is like the kind of about 20% of Gen Z and millennial women are buying about one sex toy a year. Like, I think it's like absolutely the right question to ask. Like there's a partial answer that's around consumables. There's a partial answer around like which users and how do you kind of expand demand. There's a partial answer that's around replacement and obsolescence, but I think that still lives in the world of e-com. And my answer would be like, we don't want to live in the world of e-com forever.
Yeah, that's what I thought. That's awesome. That's all good. Cheers, Lucy.
Cool. And Jesse, I might ask get you to unmute after some of these anonymous questions. I'm going to try to bring it all together since they're all in the similar theme. So it's generally around how do you actually build a community around getting people to talk about something that they're not comfortable with, and how do you like think about encouraging these people to actually speak up about it more? So I'm trying to paraphrase all of these questions together.
Sure. Like, yeah, you know, I think maybe if we call it like broadly the question of like communities around taboo, right?
Yeah.
It's a great question. Like obviously community is to a degree a buzzword right now in like startups and investing. Like everyone like loves community is the new moat. And I think like that can hide a lot of different models of community. Obviously Earlywork is a really successful one, and you will have like very sophisticated thoughts on like how do you build, like what type of community we're building, what type of interaction are we cultivating. Like for example, like in the kind of sex and relationship space, You could build a community that is like mainly just like user to user interaction, unmoderated, uncurated, and that would be Reddit. And that would like probably like over time not be necessarily like a space that like either matches our brand or serves the need of our users very well. Then you can think about like at the other end of the spectrum, like a sort of thing that is basically like a brand talking direct to users and users talking back to the brand, but very little user to user interaction and like heavy curation and moderation in terms of what goes into shared spheres. I think like what we've done initially at Normal is we almost see our role as being like we create a safe and anonymous space for people to talk about sex to us. And then we share it back to other users, and that the effect of that is to make people feel heard, feel validated, feel comfortable, and feel kind of like connected to the brand. So one of the things that we do a lot, which is really successful, is doing sort of anonymous Q&As and social takeovers on our socials. So our sex coach Georgia will just like do a call out on our stories. People will send in questions. Our sex coach Georgia will answer them for the audience, and then we'll turn those into evergreen content that lives on our socials, as well as sort of turning them into things that we can push through TikTok, turning them into things that we can push through like Facebook and Instagram, and also using that as a way to partner with like educational institutions, to partner with other brands, and to partner with influencers as sort of like, let us do this for you and your audience as well. So in doing that, we're sort of creating like a space where people feel like they can get their questions answered, but don't feel like they're kind of overly exposed. And then also a space where you can kind of tap into the like curiosity and voyeurism and just like raw interest that exists around these types of topics to create really kind of like engaging content. And then I think over time, like, and again, this is one of those things where I'm like, a couple of months, this will probably be more obvious. But over time, we actually want to think about like, how do you create sort of deliberately like curated spaces that are gated in the right way so that you can have more user to user conversation and things that feel more sort of like interactive, but sort of safe and exciting and sex positive. Yeah, generally like, I don't know, lots of brands say they want to do community and it's basically an email list.
Yeah, I think at least with Earlywork, it's definitely, we try to make a lot more than just a Slack group, more than a newsletter. There's a lot more to it. Jesse, do you want to unmute and ask a question?
Sure. Hey, Lucy. Yeah, just wondering about the flip side of those asymmetric bets. Were there any that you were super excited about that didn't land, and what were your kind of hypotheses that were disproven about what you thought would resonate but didn't end up going that way?
I'm actually trying to think of some. I think, like, I would say there have been. I actually, honestly, sorry, I swear to God, it's not like immodesty. I can't think of any that have been huge flops. The nice thing about the asymmetric bet is like the whole point is like the investment is low, the potential upside is high. So like in a lot of ways, like, you know, what we've spent on things like that truck stunt would be less than what we'd spend on like conventional marketing that day anyway. So they're really like in the scale of things, like not expensive to do. I would say like one place where I've seen really interesting like variability in returns is influencer marketing, and like there lots of influencers, you know, who have like similar kind of sizes of audience or even like demographics of audience have vastly different returns to working with them, and some of that is about like how engaged is that audience all of the time. Some of that is about how close is the fit between this person's usual content and this brand. Does it make sense? And does it sort of feel like an authentic message coming from that person, or just feel like they kind of held up a sex toy in a photo and everyone's like, that feels very transactional? And then there's a piece of it like around, I think, influencer marketing that is like, a lot of people don't understand their own value and don't understand their own audience well. And so charge like the wrong amount effectively. Like there are influencers who charge way too much. There are influencers who charge not nearly enough. Like, so like the kind of, if you look at like the set of influencers that we've worked with, we've had, you know, ROIs that are everything from 100x to like 0.1. So I think that's like an interesting space where if you can master like what are the set of people, like how do we identify people where there is asymmetric upside, and then how do you move them from like a one-time type of proposition into something that feels like a sort of more programmatic relationship, up until the point where that like the kind of effectiveness of the spend starts to decline, then you can get into something really interesting. I'm sorry, this is actually a really bad answer, but like, you know, like as long as like probably the baseline answer would be like given that it's all about asymmetric stuff with big brand stunts, if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And like you've learned something about like what does or doesn't hit as content, or does or doesn't hit as like a thing that journalists will be interested in, or whatever the kind of place that you're using to amplify it is. Yeah. And then as just, I think the main thing is like not doing irreparable harm to your brand in the process.
And you think you had to build on that point?
The 0.1 to 1000x, like, kind of like ROI on the influencers. What were the learnings there? Like, was it engagement? Was it like I'm guessing it's like how engaged the community is. Like, how do you predict that for yourself? If you are willing to share, you don't have to.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's an interesting one, because I think there's like, you can, like, the influencer marketing world is still not adequately systematized. Like, it still looks a lot like the kind of the world of like Hollywood agents. So there are like business people who act as like middlemen between influencers and brands generally, in a sort of agency format, and learning to, as quickly as possible, get the relevant data that will help you make a good decision from those people, is pretty important. I think then it's like, okay, cool. Like, what stats do we know predict this? Like, engagement predicts it. Looking carefully at like the last like 6 months of their feed to see like what their style of content is and will your messaging work, giving them options in terms of how to message. So being like, here is like, instead of like, we want you to say this exact thing, being like, here are 3 or 4 UVPs that we know work. Feel free to kind of pick one, riff in a way that feels like you, or if there's something else that you want to try that's going to feel more authentic, like feel free to pitch it to us and we're happy to try it. So that kind of giving them the ability to use what they know about their own audience. Start with like smaller buys or smaller forms of interaction, and then work up to like larger investment, and test on micro influencers first. So like figure out like who's your profile of influencer on people with smaller audiences. So then like when you're making bigger buys, you're making it knowing that. What else? Actually, honestly, like hire Gen Z interns. Like hire people who live and breathe social media as well. Like there is a part of this that, and again, it'll frustrate like all of the growth heads in the room, but like there is a part of this that is like people who are obsessed with content, who know, hey, this is this person's personality online, this is like how they behave. Like they are actually like an invaluable filter as well. So that's like the last piece. Jack, it's the Wild West out there.
I think this is a good place to end. Thank you so much, everyone, for all these really good questions, and also Lucy for sticking around to answer all of them. I think as a little virtual token of appreciation, everyone chuck up your favorite emoji, clap emoji, just to say a big thank you. Eggplants, peaches, all welcome. That's totally cool as well. Lucy, as a final thing to wrap up with, would you like to plug anything, share anything with the community? What should we be checking out from Normal?
Yeah, definitely like follow us on Instagram and TikTok, where all of the best content lives. Try our masterclass. It's you can get it with an email sign up, and it's really good. And we will be hiring soon. So if you're interested and you want to come and make penis memes all day long, then we actually don't do that. We don't do that at all. But like, like if you want to come and like see more about what we're doing, you're welcome to like reach out to me directly, or just follow us on LinkedIn and like that, and follow me on LinkedIn, and those types of things will come up from there as well. So yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much, everybody. And Lucy, once again, thank you for coming and sharing all your insights with us. And yeah, everyone have a great rest of your day.
See ya.
Thanks, Lucy.
Bye.
See you guys.